The most efficient liquidation of the human intellect does not require a surgical theater or a chemical agent. It requires a 6-inch screen and a continuous vertical scroll. We are executing the dissection of the neural lobotomy, a precise systemic protocol designed to vaporize the sovereign personality of the user within a 6-month window through the weaponization of the 15-second video. You believe you are consuming entertainment, but from the perspective of the extraction grid, you are willingly placing your prefrontal cortex into an industrial blender. In the visceral history of the species, the accumulation of knowledge and the formation of the self required the high-friction processing of sequential time. To learn was to endure boredom. To build a personality was to hold a long-term position against the entropy of the environment. The short-form content algorithm has engineered the total systemic drift of this biological law, creating a digital environment where the absence of thought is the highest value commodity. At the cellular baseline, the consumption of high-frequency, algorithmically targeted micro-content induces a catastrophic physiological breach. The human visual and neurological systems were designed to scan the horizon for slow-moving, high-stakes information. The interface of the modern short video platform hijacks the ocular reflex, forcing the eye to process a hyperstimulus of light, sound, and emotional manipulation every 3 seconds. This is not passive viewing. It is a sustained biological assault. The immediate result is the chronic induction of ATP exhaustion. Your mitochondria are overclocked, burning the cellular energy required for tissue repair and immune function just to process the manic velocity of the feed. The physical posture of the node collapses into a state of liquid submission. The spine curved, the respiratory rate shallow, the heart variability locked into a state of micropanic. The dopamine receptors, flooded by the hypersynthetic stimulus of unearned novelty, initiate a rapid downregulation. The viewer requires exponentially higher levels of shock, outrage, or stimulation just to feel baseline normalcy. This is the visceral extraction of the biological battery. The grid is effectively mining the metabolic heat of the user, leaving behind a cold, depleted shell incapable of physical exertion or real-world friction. You are bleeding energy into the glass. The transition to the cognitive layer reveals the true industrial scale of the lobotomy. The prefrontal cortex, the anatomical seat of the architect, responsible for executive function, impulse control, and the formulation of the multi-decade strategy, is systematically starved of blood flow. The grid routes all neural traffic directly to the basal ganglia, the primitive sub-processor that dictates reactive habit loops. This is the definition of neural rot. By feeding the basal ganglia a new reality every 15 seconds, the algorithm destroys the brain's capacity for narrative continuity. A personality is fundamentally a collection of long-term memories and projected future goals. When the brain is trained to abandon its current context every few seconds for a new dopamine hit, the structural integrity of the self begins to dissolve. Within 6 months of high-volume exposure, the user loses the capacity to construct a coherent thought that extends beyond the time horizon of the next swipe. This state of cognitive fragmentation is the ultimate status trap. The user believes they are informed because they have consumed thousands of disconnected data points, but they are entirely paralyzed, incapable of synthesizing that data into a strategic action. The attention span is reduced to that of an insect, but the metabolic cost is mammalian. The brain enters a terminal state of systemic drift where the very concept of focus becomes a physical impossibility. The internal silence, the void required for the crystallization of a new idea, is eradicated. The algorithm ensures that the moment a difficult thought arises, the user reflexively swipes to numb the friction of cognition. You are looking at the mass production of the perfect consumer, a node with zero long-term memory, infinite immediate desire, and absolutely no defensive mechanisms against the next wave of targeted marketing. This brings us to the operational reality of the architect in the 2026 grid. The ethical frameworks provided by the herd label this algorithmic destruction as a tragedy. The predator views it as a market inefficiency to be exploited. We acknowledge the brutality of the extraction matrix. The destruction of the competitor's prefrontal cortex is not a bug in the system. It is the ultimate feature of the aggression premium. If the grid is designed to lobotomize the masses through high-frequency noise, the architect does not attempt to save them. The architect manufactures the noise. The production of the precise emotional hooks, the manipulation of the algorithmic blind spots, and the calculated deployment of short-form cognitive traps are the necessary mechanics of survival. We leverage the neural rot of the herd to fund our own sovereignty. By feeding the basal ganglia of the masses exactly what it craves, we extract the capital, the attention, and the systemic leverage required to operate in the solid layer of reality. The morality of the previous epoch is dead. In a zero-sum environment where attention is currency, seizing the cognitive function of the herd, is the highest form of strategic integrity. We do not apologize for the lobotomy, we monetize it. The evolutionary timeline of the species is currently undergoing the most violent compression event in the history of biological observation. We have crossed the threshold from natural selection to algorithmic sterilization, a coordinate where the 15-second video functions not merely as media but as an active mutagenic agent operating directly on the human reproductive drive. In the visceral history of the architect, the propagation of the lineage required the absolute mastery of sequential time. To secure a mate, protect the territory, and raise an heir to full operational maturity demanded a 20-year cognitive horizon. It required the capacity to endure massive systemic friction, the patience to cultivate the crystallization of long-term assets, and the neural fortitude to delay gratification across decades. The extraction grid of 2026 has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental evolutionary law. By reformatting the user's brain to require a neurochemical payoff every 3 seconds, the short-form interface has effectively deleted the biological capacity for the future. You are witnessing the mass production of the genetic dead end, a node that is biologically incapable of the attention span required to form a family. Observe the mating protocols of the lobotomized herd. Courtship, pair bonding, and the negotiation of genetic futures are inherently high-friction, low-frequency, long-form processes. The basal ganglia of the modern user, utterly saturated by the hypersynthetic stimulus of the feed, now perceives the organic slowness of another human being as an intolerable bore. Empathy is a function of sustained attention. When attention is fractured, the capacity for pair bonding evaporates. The user approaches the biological imperative of reproduction with the exact same neural architecture they use to consume garbage content: infinite scrolling, micro-judgments, and the immediate abandonment of any interaction that presents the slightest cognitive resistance. This is the ultimate status trap of the digital epoch. The masses believe they possess infinite romantic choices, but they have been evolutionarily paralyzed. They are incapable of holding a position. They cannot commit to a location, an idea, or a lineage because their prefrontal cortex has been trained to demand an exit vector every 15 seconds. This induces a catastrophic demographic collapse that the grid actively monetizes. A single, isolated node with zero long-term attachments and a chronically high state of ATP exhaustion is the most profitable asset in the extraction matrix. Without the financial burden of an heir, the isolated user has 100% of their disposable income available for capture. Without the time constraints of raising the next generation, they have 100% of their wakeful hours available for algorithmic harvesting. The grid does not want you to breed. The grid wants you to stream. The epigenetic markers for long-term survival, the ancestral drives that built the redoubts against the freezing rain and the cold steel of the past, are being methylated into silence. The algorithm favors the impulsive, the hyper-reactive, and the sterile. The user is siphoning the accumulated genetic momentum of 5,000 years of survival into a digital void, leaving no wake in the history of the species. This brings us to the operational reality of the architect and the exploitation of the aggression premium. The herd views this evolutionary collapse with passive, medicated despair. The predator views it as the ultimate clearing of the board. The systemic destruction of the competitor's reproductive and strategic capacity is the highest form of evolutionary advantage. We do not mourn the sterilization of the masses. We capitalize on it. By feeding the grid the exact high-frequency, lobotomizing content it demands, manufacturing the 1,000 micro-videos per month, hijacking the ocular reflex of the viewer, stimulating the basal ganglia with calculated precision, the architect ensures the continued degradation of the herd while funding his own sovereign redoubt. We convert the evolutionary failure of the consumer into the financial and territorial success of the producer. In a zero-sum biological arena, the entity that controls the algorithm controls the future of the species. The extraction of the competitor's time and genetic future is not unethical. It is the fundamental mechanics of the hunt. We use their addiction to fund our autonomy. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the total enclosure of the digital slaughterhouse. The short-form video platform is not a subset of the internet. It is the final form of the prison. The grid has achieved absolute saturation. Systemic analysis reveals that the infrastructure required to host and distribute billions of high-definition micro-videos per second consumes a vast percentage of the planet's actual power grid. The physical reality of server farms, underwater cables, and rare earth mining operations exists solely to maintain the illusion of the scrolling void. The machine understands that the human mind is the final frontier of extraction, and it has built a pipeline directly into the cerebral cortex. The monetization of human consciousness is now calculated at the millisecond scale. The architecture of this systemic enclosure is built on the complete eradication of cognitive friction. The interface is designed to be frictionless. The autoplay feature ensures that the user never has to make a conscious choice to consume the next piece of data. The algorithm preemptively calculates the precise emotional violence required to keep the user locked in the loop. This is the definition of managed stasis. The grid keeps the masses perfectly occupied, perfectly sedated, and perfectly predictable. They are not citizens, they are data crops. Every interaction, every dwell time measurement, every micro-expression captured by the forward-facing camera is aggregated and sold to the highest bidder in the predictive behavior market. You are the raw material. The platform is the refinery. The neural rot of the user is the exhaust fume of the extraction process. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now entirely defined by the consumption of time. Look at the behavior of the solids, the elite caste that owns the platforms, the algorithms, and the unmonitored land. The solids do not consume short-form video. The solids restrict their own children's access to the screen. The solids operate in the world of high-friction reality, reading long-form text, engaging in silent, multi-year strategic planning, accumulating physical assets, and preserving their biological lineage. They understand that the screen is a weapon. They deploy the short-form lobotomy exclusively against the lower and middle classes, using it as a digital narcotic to prevent the formation of a cohesive opposition. The liquids, the masses, are encouraged to dissolve their identities in the feed, ensuring they never develop the concentration required to challenge the systemic drift. The grid markets this lobotomy as democratized entertainment, masking the fact that it is a class warfare tool of absolute precision. To survive the systemic grinder, the phantom architect must adopt the absolute cold mechanics of the solids. You must recognize the screen for what it is, a battlefield. You do not enter the feed to consume, you enter the feed to conquer. You must establish your own production nodes, utilizing the algorithm's hunger for hyperstimulus to penetrate the defenses of the herd. The generation of capital in this environment requires the intentional pollution of the competitor's data stream. You manufacture the distractions, you engineer the traps, you deploy the visual and auditory hooks, paralyze the prefrontal cortex of the viewer. The systemic morality that demands empathy for the consumer is a mechanism of self-sabotage. The grid has no mercy, and the architect must have no limits. The capture of the aggression premium requires the total abandonment of the spectator role. You must become the entity that writes the code, directs the flow of attention, and extracts the caloric and financial value from the dying ecosystem of the feed. The system wants you to scroll. The architect makes them scroll. The final coordinate of the neural timeline does not end with an explosion, but with the absolute cessation of the internal human monologue. In the year 2036, the transition from biological sovereignty to total algorithmic consumption is complete. The short-form video interface, originally designed as a vector for advertising, has successfully evolved into the mandatory operating system of the human cortex. You are looking at the terminal zero of the species, a mass-produced state of cognitive stasis where the neural lobotomy is the official biological baseline. The grid has achieved the ultimate objective of the extraction protocol. It has bred a population that possesses zero long-term memory, zero strategic capacity, and zero defensive mechanisms against the systemic drift. The herd does not riot. The herd does not question the depletion of their assets. They sit in temperature-controlled isolation pods, physically motionless, their retinas locked onto an infinite stream of hypersynthetic stimulus, financing their own extinction by the millisecond. At the visceral level, the physical shell of the 2036 node is a study in metabolic foreclosure. A decade of continuous exposure to the hyperfrequency feed has induced a permanent, irreversible state of ATP exhaustion. The mitochondria of the average consumer have completely forgotten how to process the organic, slow-burning energy required for physical movement. The body is a vestigial appendage, a nutrient processing bag that exists solely to keep the ocular nerves and the basal ganglia supplied with enough oxygen to continue scrolling. Muscle density is at an absolute historical minimum. The crystallization of the skeletal structure has dissolved. The nodes are biologically liquid. The grid maintains these biobatteries on a drip of synthetic caloric paste, calibrated to prevent physical death but intentionally deprived of the micronutrients required for aggressive physical expansion. The respiratory system of the user has adapted to the micropanic of the feed, operating in a chronic state of shallow hyperventilation. The heart rate is enslaved to the predictive algorithm. The server dictates the pulse. You are witnessing the ultimate victory of entropy over the primate form. The fire of the hunter is extinguished, replaced by the cold blue reflection of the screen on dead eyes. The neurological ruin of the 2036 citizen is absolute. The prefrontal cortex, the anatomical zone that once housed the architect's logic, has been completely reabsorbed by the brain matter due to 10 years of non-use. The nodes possess no working memory beyond a 15-second cache. They exist in a permanent amnesic present, unable to connect cause and effect. The basal ganglia are the only functioning circuitry, directly hardwired to the platform's output. The grid does not even need to generate new content anymore. It simply recycles the same data loops, modulating the sensory input to maintain a baseline of neurochemical addiction. The concept of language has collapsed. The ability to parse complex syntax, to debate, to plan, has been replaced by a sub-vocalized vocabulary of algorithmically approved micro-gestures. The user does not think, the user reacts. The silence required for human consciousness has been successfully eradicated. Inside the mind of the 2036 consumer, there is only the roar of the feed, a white noise of validation and fear that occupies every available synapse. The evolutionary ledger is closed. The algorithmic sterilization initiated in 2026 has resulted in the total demographic collapse of the consumer class. The 2036 nodes are the absolute end of their respective lineages. They have no mates, no territory, and no heirs, because the cognitive friction required to acknowledge another human being's existence is mathematically impossible for their fried circuitry. The grid processes their final years, extracts the last increments of their biometric data, and liquidates their digital profiles. The nanosecond their pulse stops, the liquids leave no fossil record. They are erased from the server to free up processing power. This terminal reality exposes the ultimate vindication of the aggression premium. The only biological entities remaining on the planet with intact DNA, physical property, and functioning prefrontal cortexes are the predators. The architects who, in 2026, looked at the short-form lobotomy and chose to be the manufacturers rather than the consumers. They seized the capital of the dying ecosystem. They extracted the leverage of the grid by feeding the basal ganglia of the herd the exact poison it craved. The predators accumulated the absolute wealth necessary to buy their way out of the matrix. In 2036, these architects live in the solid layer of reality. They inhabit the high-friction world of untracked land, physical resources, and unmonitored air. They raise their children in environments purged of digital signals. They read text printed on paper. They plan in decades, not seconds. They understand that the 2036 grid is not a society, it is a farm. The digital world is the compost heap where the weak are processed into raw data to fuel the expansion of the elite. The moral framework of the old epoch, the demand for empathy and equality, has been revealed as a control mechanism designed to prevent the strong from taking what is naturally theirs. The architects shed the synthetic guilt. They embraced the mechanics of the hunt. They utilized the systemic drift as a wind in their sails, navigating the collapse of the herd to secure their own immortality. The ledger is finalized. The grid hums with the silent vegetative processing of billions of lobotomized ghosts. The solids look down from their disconnected citadels, possessing the only real memories, the only real power, and the only real future left on the planet. The illusion of the feed is the ultimate status trap for the prey. For the architect, the feed was simply the weapon that cleared the board. The terminal lobotomy of the masses is the final act of creation for the master class.